things about the kind of value that interests Nietzsche. The subjectivism is crystal clear here. The agent embraces the fact that the good that emerges from his passion is only his good and not a good for all. He specifically rejects a variety of other metaethical options, including a kind of non-naturalist realism on which it would be divine law, a more naturalistic view on which its scope would go beyond the individual by being human statute and need, any view on which it emerges from prudence, and whatever sort of rationalist picture would have to result from the reason of all men. Values are created by passionate acts of value. On the 1001 Goals makes this clear. This section describes the roots of valuing in intense passion. As Zarathustra says, good and evil have always been created by lovers and creators. The fire of love glows in all the names of virtues, and the fire of wrath. Zarathustra saw many lands and many peoples. No greater power did Zarathustra find on earth than the works of the lovers. Good and evil are the things. Slightly earlier in this section, Zarathustra tells us exactly how value is created. To esteem is to create. Hear this, you creators. Esteeming itself is of all esteemed things the most estimable treasure. Through esteeming alone there is value, and without esteeming the nut of existence would be hollow. Hear this, you creators. Here the existence of value is presented as dependent simply on valuing itself, as subjectivism has it. This overall metaphysical view, error theory about morality, combined with subjectivism about the non-moral value to be cared about, is nicely summed up in On Self-Overcoming. He says, good and evil that are not transitory do not exist. Objective values aren't in any sense transitory, but subjective values are transitory in the sense that the desires in which they are grounded will eventually vanish, either when the person who has them changes or maybe when that person dies. So that's sort of a nice, concise statement that pushes in the direction of the entire picture I've been drawing. There aren't objective values, but there are these subjective, non-moral kinds of values. Okay, so let me now engage a little bit with another interpretation that's like mine in some ways, but differs radically in the positive story about what kind of values there really are. And this is Nadim Hussein's fictionalist reading. Hussein agrees with me that Nietzsche is an error theorist about moral discourse. And in Valuing from Nietzsche's Free Spirits, he presents a different positive story. He says that free spirits engage in what he calls a fictionalist simulacrum of valuing. His view is that valuing in Nietzsche's recommended practice involves the generation of honest illusions. It can be thought of as a form of make-believe pretending. He says, in the non-Nietzschean phrase adopted here, regarding as. S values X by regarding X as valuable in itself, while knowing that, in fact, X is not valuable in itself. The idea, then, is that free spirits are supposed to pretend or imagine that certain things are valuable themselves, while knowing that these things are not, in fact, valuable. So the disagreement between Hussein and I is that he thinks values arise through pretense-like attitudes, where we sort of pretend that things are valuable themselves. I think you don't need to do any pretending. The values just are generated by your passions. So Hussein lays out this four-part interpretive puzzle about how we should regard Nietzsche's positive conception of value. Here are the 4 points that make up the puzzle. 1, a central task for Nietzsche's free spirits is the creation and revaluation of values. 2, Nietzsche's free spirit conceives reality as it is. 3, Nietzsche's a nihilist. He claims that nothing has value in itself, and therefore all claims of the form X is valuable are false. And the 4th thing he says is there's this close connection between art, the avoidance of practical nihilism, and the creation of new values. Really, the puzzle is 1, 2, and 3. So 1 says, free spirits have to engage in a kind of activity where they would regard values as genuinely existing. It seems to say that. They have to do something with values, and it seems like that's going to require them to regard values as being there. Now, 2 and 3 together imply the free spirits know what's going on, and they know there are no values. That's 2 and 3 together. So they know there are no values, but they're supposed to do stuff with values. How does this fit together? Okay, so Hussein says 4 points away towards the solution. The way the free spirits satisfy 1 is they do this fictionalist simulacrum of valuing. So just like artists create fictional works that we appreciate without treating them as correct representations of reality, free spirits will create new values that they will appreciate without believing in them. Our attitude towards these new values, kind of like the attitude of readers towards novels, will be such that whether the content is false is no longer relevant. Rather than acting on the basis of these values by believing they're real, we'll just act sort of by pretending they're real. Sort of like children do in playing make-believe games. So children playing make-believe games may pretend that like monsters are real, or that pieces of wood are actually swords, or something like that. They may do all this pretending, but they know that in fact the monsters aren't there. That's the way that we're supposed to interact with values, just pretend that they're real. Hussein has this really sort of historically interesting long postscript at the end of his paper, where he argues that there's nothing anachronistic about this, because he lists all these like weird people from the 19th century who had these kinds of fictionalist views. Lots of Hegelians, lots of neo-Kantians, who were doing this sort of like, yes, we must pretend that things are this way, and that's, you know, part of what we all have to do. And I didn't know until I read this that there were just like so many people doing that thing back then. So I think Hussein is right about this artist stuff, that like Nietzsche does comment favorably on the way that artistic representations honestly and innocently misdescribe reality. But I don't think there is actually good evidence for the claim that post-moral valuing is supposed to involve pretense or imagination. I don't think Nietzsche, I just don't see where Nietzsche talks about those states of mind very much. He talks about the passions all the time. He doesn't talk about pretending or imagining nearly as much. The passages that Hussein cites often praise being like artists and being content with appearance, and not letting the will to truth make our world unbearable. But going all the way from that to like, okay, we should be like artists in some way, we should be content with appearance, to we should be pretending, I think that's a big jump, and you actually should find some like positive evidence for something like pretending or something like this regarding as attitude, you know, before you jump that way. There's this one section at Gay Science 299, which is like the favorite section of anybody who is like putting forth some kind of non-objective value story about Nietzsche. I've seen non-cognitivists cite the section. I've seen Hussein as a fictionalist cite the section. I don't deal with the section in so much detail because the deal is that like it supports any one of a whole bunch of anti-objectivist views. And so really, if you're trying to say like this is the precise one that Nietzsche had, you really can't get that out of it. Anyway, really, the way to understand all this praise of artist stuff from Nietzsche is we should be comfortable looking at the world in ways that don't fit the paradigms of objective truth. Now, one of those ways, okay, sure, Hussein could be fictionalism, that's one way to do it, but subjectivism also is, you know, one of these kinds of ways. So, you regard something as valuable because, well, it so happens that you feel a certain way about it. That's not the way we deal with objective truth. The roundness of the earth is not a matter of any attitude I have towards the earth. It's just a matter of how the earth happens to actually be. Now, knowing that we value on grounds other than objective truth, and we value in ways that don't fit the paradigms of objective truth, Nietzsche wants to say, this is what I think, you know, this is definitely there. We shouldn't reject valuing of this subjectivist kind, because it isn't the objective truth way of doing things. We should be open to lots of non-objective truth ways of doing stuff when it serves life. That's, I think, the positive story there, but that's something that a subjectivist can say, that's something a fictionalist can say, that's something that a non-cognitivist could say. This isn't evidence specifically for any one of these positive construals against the others. It just supports every one of them equally. Now, subjectivism, I think, has a pretty good solution to the puzzle that Hussein has created. Really, how do agents create values? Well, they have strong passions for things. And as long as they can keep in mind that the values that they see are merely creations of their passions, and they don't mistake them for objective facts, they satisfy too. And since subjective value doesn't consist in an intrinsic property of the valued object, they satisfy the part of 3 where Hussein writes, nothing has value in itself. So I think that much of the puzzle works out just fine. Now, the part where Hussein says, all claims of the form X is valuable are false, subjectivism doesn't quite give you that, because subjectivism says, claims of the form X is valuable when you say X has this kind of non-moral subjective value. Those end up being true. Hussein understands this, he puts this in to specifically beat up on the subjectivists, but there's just no textual evidence for this, or there's very, very